Picture this, a 50-room mansion perched on the most treacherous edge of Newport, Rhode Island, where waves crash against jagged rocks with such fury that sailors once called these waters the graveyard of ships, and inside, behind walls that have witnessed more darkness than most horror films could conjure, lies the complete, unvarnished story of American wealth at its most complex, most contradictory, and most deeply human. This is Rough Point, the summer estate of Doris Duke, the woman once crowned the richest girl in the world, and if you think you know this story because you've heard whispers about the tobacco fortune, the eccentric heiress, or that one terrible scandal involving her interior decorator, then prepare yourself, because what really happened within these walls, what Doris Duke actually lived through, fought against, and ultimately tried to atone for, is a narrative so layered with tragedy, controversy, resilience, and radical generosity that it forces us to ask the most uncomfortable questions about inherited wealth, about what we owe to history, about whether redemption is possible when your fortune is built on addiction and death, and about whether opening your private palace to the public can ever truly balance the scales of privilege. Doris Duke didn't choose to be born in 1912 as the only child of James Buchanan Duke, the man who quite literally invented the modern cigarette industry, who transformed tobacco from a regional crop into a global addiction, who built the American Tobacco Company into a trust so powerful that the Supreme Court had to break it apart, and who, by the time he commissioned the construction of Rough Point in 1887, 25 years before Doris's birth, had already amassed a fortune that would be worth billions in today's currency, all of it extracted from the lungs of millions, all of it stained with the knowledge that every mansion, every yacht, every priceless artwork was purchased with money that represented countless early deaths, ruined health, and shattered families, yet this was the world Doris inherited at age 12 when her father died in 1925, leaving her approximately $100 million, about $1.5 billion today, and making her, quite literally, the wealthiest child in America, a distinction that sounds like a fairy tale but functioned more like a prison sentence, because from that moment forward, every person who approached her, every friendship offered, every romantic overture, every business proposition, every kind word, was tainted by the question, do they want me, or do they want my money? Rough Point itself, designed by the architectural firm Peabody and Stearns in the robust shingle style that defined Newport's Gilded Age cottages, was originally built for Frederick William Vanderbilt, another titan of American industry, and even its location tells you everything about the psychology of the men who built these palaces, while other Newport mansions like the Breakers and Marble House were positioned to be seen, to announce their owner's status to passing carriages and envious peers. Rough Point was deliberately placed on the most isolated, most dangerous, most dramatically beautiful promontory on Ocean Avenue, as if Vanderbilt was saying, I'm so wealthy, so powerful, that I can tame even this savage landscape, I can build my summer cottage on the very edge of catastrophe and dare nature to challenge me. And when James Duke purchased it for $375,000 in 1922, he understood exactly what that location symbolized: absolute dominion, complete control, the kind of power that bends the natural world itself to your will. But Doris's childhood at Rough Point was not the sun-drenched, carefree existence you might imagine. Instead, it was characterized by suffocating isolation, by her mother Nanoline's obsessive control, by the constant presence of servants who were instructed to remain invisible, by tutors and governesses who taught her everything except how to form genuine human connections, by the growing awareness that she was not a person but a commodity. A walking, breathing billion-dollar asset that required management, protection, and strategic deployment, and perhaps most cruelly, by the knowledge that her father's fortune, the source of all this privilege, came from a product that was killing people by the thousands, that every cigarette sold represented a tiny transaction of death for money, and that she, through no choice of her own, was the primary beneficiary of this blood economy. The mansion itself, with its 50 rooms spread across 39,000 square feet, its English Gothic Revival interiors commissioned by the famed decorator Ogden Codman Jr., its stained glass windows, its carved oak paneling, its tapestries and portraits and Chinese porcelains, was less a home than a stage set, a physical manifestation of the performance that old money required, the performance of taste, of culture, of belonging to an aristocratic tradition that America, for all its democratic ideals, secretly craved. And young Doris, wandering these vast, echoing spaces, must have felt like a ghost haunting someone else's dream of grandeur. As she entered adulthood in the 1930s, Doris Duke made choices that both challenged and reinforced the expectations placed upon women of her class. She became an accomplished surfer at a time when women's beach activities were heavily restricted. She studied jazz piano and genuinely connected with black musicians in an era of rigid segregation. She traveled extensively through Asia and the Middle East, developing a passion for Islamic art and architecture that was genuine and informed rather than merely acquisitive, and in 1935, at age 23, she married James Cromwell, a man twice her age who claimed to be a self-made entrepreneur but who everyone knew was primarily interested in her fortune, a marriage that lasted just 8 years and produced no children but did result in the construction of Shangri-La, her magnificent Hawaiian estate that represented her own vision of paradise rather than an inherited one. Yet even as Doris attempted to forge an independent identity, Rough Point remained the anchor, the symbol of everything she could never fully escape: the Duke name, the tobacco money, the expectations of Newport society, and increasingly, as the 20th century progressed, the uncomfortable questions about what all this wealth actually meant, what obligations it carried, and whether it was possible to use a fortune built on harm to create something genuinely good. The first major scandal to truly rock Rough Point came in 1966, though its roots stretched back to Doris's increasingly unconventional lifestyle choices. She had become known for her complicated relationships, her interest in spiritual pursuits including Hare Krishna devotion, her tendency to hire staff based on personal connection rather than professional credentials, and her growing isolation from the Newport social circuit that had once defined summer life among America's elite. And into this context came Eduardo Tirella, a talented interior decorator and set designer who had worked with Hollywood studios and who Doris hired to oversee renovations at Rough Point and her other properties. Eduardo was charming, creative, openly gay at a time when such openness carried enormous professional and personal risk, and by all accounts, he and Doris developed a close working relationship, perhaps even a genuine friendship, though some observers noted that Doris, accustomed to control, sometimes treated even those closest to her as employees rather than equals, a dynamic that revealed how thoroughly the master-servant relationship of her childhood had shaped her understanding of human connection. On October 7, 1966, Eduardo was preparing to leave Rough Point, planning to drive to the airport for a flight to California where he hoped to pursue film production opportunities independent of Doris's patronage, and this departure, this assertion of independence, may have been more threatening to Doris than anyone realized, because what happened next remains one of the most controversial and disputed events in Newport history. As Eduardo got out of Doris's Dodge Polara station wagon to open the heavy iron gates at Rough Point's entrance, Doris, sitting in the driver's seat, claimed that the car lurched forward unexpectedly, pinning Eduardo against the gates and crushing him to death, and while the official police investigation ruled it a tragic accident, and Doris was never charged with any crime, the whispers began immediately, whispers that would follow her for the remaining 27 years of her life. Did the car really malfunction, or did Doris, in a moment of rage at being abandoned, press the accelerator deliberately? Was Eduardo's death truly an accident, or was it, as some claimed, a crime that wealth and influence allowed Doris to escape? The physical evidence was ambiguous. The car showed no mechanical defects, but investigators noted that the gates at Rough Point were extremely heavy and difficult to open, requiring Eduardo to step directly in front of the vehicle, and Doris's own testimony included inconsistencies that raised questions. She initially told police she was in the passenger seat, then later admitted she had been driving, a discrepancy that, in a less wealthy defendant, might have sparked immediate criminal charges. The local Newport police, however, accepted her account, closed the investigation within days, and Eduardo Tirella was buried, his death officially recorded as accidental, though his family, friends, and a growing number of skeptics believed that justice had not been served, that once again, extraordinary wealth had purchased freedom from consequences that ordinary people would have faced. What makes this tragedy even more disturbing is the context of power dynamics. Eduardo, despite his talent and charm, was ultimately an employee, dependent on Doris's patronage, working in a system where the ultra-wealthy could hire, fire, and control the lives of those who served them with almost feudal authority, and whether his death was accident or crime, It illuminated the stark reality that even in mid-20th century America, with its democratic ideals and legal protections, the lives of those without wealth were simply worth less, were more expendable, were subject to narratives controlled by those with money and power. Doris Duke, for her part, never publicly expressed remorse beyond brief statements through lawyers, never attended Eduardo's funeral, and within weeks had left Newport for her other properties, leaving Rough Point to sit largely empty for months, its gates, the very gates that had become an instrument of death, standing as a grim reminder of what had occurred, and you have to ask yourself, how do you live with that? How do you walk through those gates every day knowing what happened there? How do you reconcile the beauty and privilege of your existence with the knowledge that someone died, possibly by your hand, and that your wealth allowed you to avoid any real accountability? The answer, it seems, was that Doris Duke dealt with it the way old money often deals with scandal. She moved on, she focused on other projects, she deployed her wealth in ways that would eventually build a legacy of philanthropy that complicated the narrative, and she kept Rough Point as one of her primary residences, spending summers there until her death, as if the mansion itself had become a kind of penance, a constant reminder of both her privilege and its terrible costs. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Doris Duke's life continued to be characterized by contradiction. She funded important preservation projects, including the Newport Restoration Foundation that saved dozens of colonial-era houses from demolition, transforming Newport from a decaying relic of Gilded Age excess into a living museum of American architectural history. She supported jazz musicians, wildlife conservation, and international arts education. She built meaningful relationships with people from diverse backgrounds, particularly during her extended stays in Hawaii where Shangri-La became a center for Islamic art scholarship, yet simultaneously, she remained a deeply controlling, often difficult person, cycling through staff with alarming frequency, engaging in lawsuits over trivial matters, and displaying the kind of erratic behavior that money usually allows wealthy people to indulge without institutional intervention. Rough Point itself, during these decades, became almost a time capsule, frozen in a particular vision of elite taste. The interiors remained largely unchanged from their 1920s and 1930s configurations, filled with museum-quality Chinese porcelains, European furniture, Turkish rugs, and paintings by Reynolds, Gainsborough, and Van Dyck, yet the mansion was not open to the public, not shared with the community that surrounded it, not positioned as an educational resource. It was simply Doris's private possession, another jewel in a collection that included properties in Beverly Hills, Manhattan, New Jersey, and Hawaii, all maintained by staffs of dozens, all consuming enormous resources, all representing a lifestyle of such extreme privilege that it had become almost incomprehensible to ordinary Americans who were struggling through economic recessions, oil crises, and the dismantling of the middle-class social contract. The question that haunted Rough Point, that hung in the air like the salt spray from the crashing waves below, was this: what does society owe to the ultra-wealthy, and what do the ultra-wealthy owe to society? Doris Duke's father had built his fortune by creating and marketing an addictive product that killed its consumers. He had employed thousands in the tobacco fields and factories under conditions that were often brutal and exploitative. He had wielded monopolistic power that required Supreme Court intervention to break, and he had passed all of this wealth, and all of this moral complexity, to his only daughter, who had no choice about inheriting it but every choice about what to do with it, and for most of her life, Doris's answer was contradictory: yes to selective philanthropy in areas that interested her, yes to preservation of beautiful things, yes to supporting artists and musicians she admired, but also yes to maintaining a lifestyle of extraordinary excess, yes to the servants and the mansions and the private planes, yes to the fundamental inequality that her existence represented. The second major scandal at Rough Point erupted in the final years of Doris Duke's life, and this one was even darker, even more revealing of the dysfunction that extreme wealth can enable. In 1987, Doris hired Chandy Hefner, a woman 35 years her junior whom she had met through mutual interests in Eastern spirituality. And in an extraordinary move that shocked even those accustomed to Doris's eccentricity, she legally adopted Chandy as her daughter in 1988, naming her as heir to the Duke fortune despite having no prior family relationship and despite Chandy's questionable credentials and motives. For a brief period, it seemed that Doris, then in her mid-70s and increasingly isolated, had finally found the family connection she had craved, the daughter she had never had, and Chandy moved into Rough Point, helped manage Doris's affairs, traveled with her to the various properties, and positioned herself as the primary gatekeeper to the aging heiress. But within just 3 years, the relationship had soured completely. Doris became convinced that Chandy was only interested in her money, that the spiritual connection had been manufactured, that she had been deceived, and in 1991, she disowned Chandy, removing her from the will and embarking on a bitter legal battle that would consume the final years of her life. And into the vacuum left by Chandy's departure came Bernard Lafferty, an Irish butler with a history of alcohol problems whom Doris inexplicably promoted to the position of chief executor of her estate, giving him enormous power over her financial and personal affairs despite his lack of qualifications and his obvious personal struggles. What followed was a grotesque spectacle that played out in tabloids and courtrooms. Doris Duke died in October 1993 at age 80, and almost immediately, questions arose about the circumstances of her death, the authenticity of her final will, and Bernard Lafferty's role in her final days. Had he, as some alleged, isolated Doris from other advisors, controlled her medication, and essentially held her captive in her own homes, including Rough Point, while ensuring that the will was structured to give him maximum control and compensation. The legal battles that erupted after Doris's death were spectacular even by the standards of estate litigation. Chandy Hefner sued for her share of the fortune, claiming the adoption had been valid and that Doris had been unduly influenced in disinheriting her. Multiple former employees came forward with allegations of abuse, neglect, and financial impropriety. Questions were raised about whether Doris had been mentally competent in her final years, and Bernard Lafferty, now the executor of a $1.2 billion estate, became a figure of public ridicule and suspicion, appearing in court in elaborate disguises, giving rambling testimony, and ultimately dying himself in 1996, still embroiled in litigation, his own alcoholism having accelerated to fatal levels. What does it tell us that Doris Duke, who had spent her entire life trying to forge meaningful human connections, who had been so desperate for family that she adopted a stranger, who had surrounded herself with servants and advisors and spiritual guides, died essentially alone, her final years characterized by paranoia, litigation, and manipulation by those she had trusted? What does it reveal about the corrosive effects of extreme wealth, about how money warps every relationship, makes every kindness suspect, turns even family into a financial transaction, and ultimately isolates those who possess it most completely from the very human connection they most desperately need? Rough Point, during these final scandals, became almost a symbol of this isolation, a magnificent mansion on a desolate promontory, filled with priceless treasures, maintained by a rotating staff of servants, yet fundamentally empty, fundamentally lonely, a physical manifestation of the paradox that you can possess everything and still have nothing that truly matters. But here is where the story of Rough Point takes its most unexpected turn, where Doris Duke's complex legacy reveals its most redemptive dimension. In her final will, despite all the controversy and litigation, despite Bernard Lafferty's questionable influence, Doris Duke established the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation with the bulk of her fortune, directing that the money be used for the support of medical research, the prevention of cruelty to children and animals, the preservation of wildlife, the performance of arts, and the preservation of environmental and cultural resources, and crucially, she designated Rough Point, along with Shangri-La and Duke Farms, to be preserved and open to the public as museums, transforming her private palaces into educational institutions, her personal collections into public resources, and her legacy from one of secretive wealth into one of accessible cultural heritage. The process of transforming Rough Point from private mansion to public museum was neither quick nor easy. It required years of legal work to settle the estate disputes, careful conservation of the collections, development of educational programming, installation of climate control and security systems, training of docents, and most challengingly, the crafting of a narrative that would tell the full, complicated story of the house and its owner, not the sanitized fairy tale of philanthropic nobility, but not the sensationalized tabloid version of scandal and dysfunction either, but rather the honest, nuanced truth that Doris Duke was a deeply flawed human being who inherited an immoral fortune, who lived a life of extraordinary privilege that sometimes enabled cruelty and always enforced inequality, who was victimized by her own wealth even as she wielded it as power, and who ultimately tried, in her own complicated way, to give something back, to transform inherited wealth into public good, to open the gates that had for so long kept the world out. Rough Point opened to the public in 2000, 7 years after Doris Duke's death, and what visitors encounter there is unlike almost any other historic house museum in America. Yes, you see the breathtaking stained glass, the museum-quality art collection, the carved wooden ceilings and imported marble fireplaces, the Turkish rugs and Chinese porcelains and European furniture that represent the apex of Gilded Age collecting, but you also hear about Eduardo Tirella, about the gates where he died. About the questions that were never fully answered, about how wealth can insulate people from consequences. You learn about the servants who maintained this impossible standard of perfection, about the rigid hierarchies below stairs, about the invisible labor that made this lifestyle possible. You discover the contradictions of Doris Duke's life, her genuine passion for art and preservation alongside her controlling behavior and erratic personal relationships, her generous philanthropy. Alongside her enormous personal consumption, and you're forced to confront the fundamental question that Rough Point poses. What is the relationship between beauty and justice, between private property and public good, between inherited wealth and earned merit, between the treasures that money can buy and the human costs that are paid to acquire them? The curators and historians who now manage Rough Point have made a deliberate choice to tell this full story, to resist the temptation to sanitize or simplify, and in doing so, they've created something rare and valuable, a historic house that functions not as a shrine to wealth but as a critical examination of it, not as a celebration of the Gilded Age but as a reckoning with its costs, not as an escape into a fantasy of aristocratic elegance but as a mirror that reflects contemporary America's own struggles with inequality, inherited advantage, and the obligations that come with extreme wealth. Walk through Rough Point today, and you'll stand in the very room where Doris Duke spent her final days. You'll look out the windows at the same crashing waves that she watched. You'll run your hand along the same carved oak banister that she touched thousands of times, and you'll understand that this is not just a house, not just a museum, but a physical embodiment of America's most uncomfortable truths about class, about privilege, about the ways that money, especially money built on harm, shapes lives across generations, creating gilded cages for those who inherit it and crushing those who serve it. The architectural details of Rough Point itself tell this story in 3 dimensions. The shingle-style exterior, with its complex rooflines and varied textures, speaks to the late 19th century American desire to create a domestic architecture that was distinct from European models, that celebrated craft and natural materials, that suggested a kind of rustic authenticity even as it enclosed spaces of extreme formality and opulence. The interior spaces, renovated by Ogden Codman Jr. in the 1920s, reflect the colonial revival and English Gothic revival tastes of that era, a deliberate rejection of the more ornate French and Italian styles that had dominated earlier Gilded Age mansions, as if by adopting a more tasteful, more historically American aesthetic, the Dukes could claim a kind of legitimacy, a rootedness in American tradition that their actual history, tobacco fortune, recent wealth, no aristocratic lineage, could not provide, and the setting itself, that dramatic promontory where the mansion seems to defy the elements, where the ocean crashes against the rocks with such violence that you can feel the spray and hear the thunder even from inside the house, embodies the ultimate fantasy of dominion that drove men like Vanderbilt and Duke, the fantasy that enough money can purchase control over nature itself, can allow you to build your pleasure palace in the most inhospitable location imaginable simply because you can, because your wealth is so vast that it can reshape landscapes, redirect roads, import soil and trees and even change the contours of the coastline to suit your vision. Yet nature, as it always does, has the last word. The salt air corrodes the metalwork, the storms damage the roofs, the foundations shift on the unstable coastal geology, and the mansion requires constant, expensive maintenance to prevent it from slowly deteriorating back into the landscape, a perfect metaphor for wealth itself, which must be constantly managed, invested, protected, or it will dissipate, which creates an entire ecosystem of lawyers and accountants and property managers whose livelihoods depend on the preservation of extreme inequality, and which ultimately cannot protect its possessors from the fundamental human experiences of loneliness, betrayal, aging, and death. The collections inside Rough Point reveal Doris Duke's genuine connoisseurship but also her acquisitiveness, her need to possess beautiful things perhaps because human relationships proved so unreliable, Chinese export porcelains from the 18th and 19th centuries, acquired not randomly but with real knowledge and discrimination, European paintings, including works by major artists but also lesser-known pieces that Doris simply loved, Turkish and Persian rugs that demonstrate her deep engagement with Islamic art and her willingness to learn about cultures that most of her social class dismissed or exoticized, and personal items, photographs, books, correspondence, that humanize her, that show a woman reading in her favorite chair, practicing piano, entertaining friends, living an actual life within these formal spaces, not just staging them for display. The staff areas of Rough Point, which the museum now includes in some tours, are perhaps the most revelatory spaces of all. Here you see the butler's pantry where silver was polished, the servant's staircase that allowed staff to move invisibly through the house, the kitchen where elaborate meals were prepared, the basement storage areas where supplies were kept, and you begin to understand the enormous infrastructure required to maintain this lifestyle, the dozens of servants who lived either in the house or in outbuildings, who were subject to strict hierarchies and behavioral codes, who could be dismissed without notice, who had no privacy and little autonomy, whose labor was essential but whose humanity was often invisible to those they served, and who lived in a state of economic dependence that gave employers enormous power over every aspect of their lives. This is the system that supported not just Rough Point but all of the great houses of the Gilded Age and beyond, the system that persisted well into the 20th century, the system that Doris Duke both relied upon and, occasionally, chafed against. She was known for sometimes treating staff as confidants, for breaking down the formal barriers, for involving servants in her personal life in ways that made other wealthy people uncomfortable, yet she also fired people capriciously, sued former employees, and maintained the fundamental power imbalance that defined the employer-servant relationship, unable or unwilling to fully dismantle the structure even as she occasionally critiqued it. What makes Rough Point particularly powerful as a museum is that it refuses to resolve these contradictions, refuses to offer a simple moral judgment of Doris Duke as either villain or hero, and instead presents the full complexity. Here was a woman born into unconscionable wealth built on addiction and death, who inherited all the privilege and all the moral weight of that fortune, who lived a life of extraordinary access and opportunity unavailable to 99.9% of humanity, who did both generous and cruel things, who was both victim of her wealth and wielder of its power, who died isolated and embattled, and who ultimately chose, whether from genuine altruism, guilt, desire for legacy, or some mixture of all three, to transform her private treasures into public resources, to open the gates that had been closed for so long, to allow the world to see not just the beauty she had collected but the full story of how it was acquired and what it cost. The preservation of Rough Point also raises crucial questions about cultural heritage and whose stories we choose to preserve. Newport, Rhode Island, is filled with Gilded Age mansions, many now operated as museums, and together they create a narrative about American history that centers wealth, that celebrates the captains of industry, who built these palaces, that presents inequality as a kind of natural law rather than a political choice, and that risks teaching visitors that this is simply how society works. Some people are destined for mansions and others for servant quarters, some people collect art and others polish silver, some people make history and others are merely scenery in someone else's story. Rough Point, by choosing to tell a more complete and critical narrative, by including information about Eduardo Tirella, about the servants, about the origins of the Duke fortune, about the scandals and dysfunction alongside the philanthropy and preservation, offers a different model. Historic preservation that serves not to glorify wealth but to examine it, not to escape from the present but to better understand it, not to celebrate the past but to reckon with it honestly, and this is the kind of cultural work that museums must do if they are to remain relevant and ethical institutions rather than simply temples to the taste of the rich. The landscape of Rough Point, too, tells a story that extends beyond the mansion itself. The famous front gates where Eduardo Tirella died have been preserved, a memorial in iron to that terrible day, impossible to pass through without remembering what happened there. The gardens, designed and redesigned over the decades, represent changing fashions in landscape architecture but also the enormous resources required to maintain beauty in a hostile coastal environment where salt and wind kill most plants. The views across the ocean, spectacular and valuable beyond measure, represent a kind of natural wealth that Doris Duke had the privilege to enjoy daily while others could only glimpse it from the public sections of the cliff walk, and the property boundaries themselves, surveyed and defended with typical wealthy person vigilance, represent the fundamental act of enclosure, of declaring that this portion of the earth's surface belongs exclusively to one person, that others may not enter or enjoy it without permission, that money translates directly into the control of land, views, access, and experience. When the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation decided to open Rough Point to the public, they made another crucial choice. They set admission prices low enough that the museum would be accessible to a broad range of visitors, not just to other wealthy people, and they developed educational programs specifically for local students, for community groups, for audiences who might never otherwise enter such a space, recognizing that if Rough Point was to function as a genuine educational resource rather than merely another elite attraction, it needed to actively welcome those who had historically been excluded, needed to work against the property's own history of exclusion and privilege, needed to become something genuinely different from what it had been during Doris Duke's lifetime. The ongoing work of interpreting Rough Point involves constant evolution, as new scholarship emerges about the tobacco industry, about labor conditions in the Gilded Age, about gender and power, about inheritance and inequality. The museum's narratives must adapt, as social movements like Black Lives Matter and fights for economic justice change public consciousness about wealth and race and class. The way we understand and present Rough Point must change too, and as new generations of visitors arrive with different questions, different values, different frameworks for understanding the past, the museum must find ways to remain relevant, to speak to contemporary concerns, to demonstrate that examining this house and this woman's life can illuminate present-day struggles with the same fundamental issues of power, privilege, accountability, and justice. One of the most fascinating aspects of Rough Point's current interpretation is how it handles the question of taste and beauty. The mansion is undeniably beautiful, the collections are of museum quality, the craftsmanship is extraordinary, and visitors naturally respond with admiration, with wonder, with a kind of aspirational desire to live in such spaces surrounded by such treasures. Yet the museum simultaneously works to complicate that response, to ask, at what cost was this beauty created? Who paid the price? Is our aesthetic admiration separate from or entangled with moral judgment? Can we enjoy beautiful things while also recognizing the injustice that made them possible, and what do we do with cultural heritage that is both valuable and compromised? These are not abstract questions, they're deeply relevant to contemporary debates about museum ethics, about repatriation of cultural objects, about naming buildings after donors whose wealth may be tainted, about whether universities and cultural institutions should accept money from controversial sources, and about what we owe to the victims and the workers and the communities who were harmed in the creation of the fortunes that now fund so much of our cultural infrastructure. Rough Point doesn't answer these questions definitively, but by posing them honestly, by creating space for visitors to grapple with them, by refusing to offer a sanitized narrative that would make everyone comfortable, the museum performs a crucial civic function. It trains us in the kind of critical thinking, the kind of moral complexity, the kind of historical consciousness that we desperately need if we're to address contemporary inequality and build a more just society. The influence of Rough Point extends beyond its physical boundaries and its visitors. By choosing to tell a complicated story, by preserving both the grandeur and the scandal, by including voices and perspectives that would traditionally be excluded from elite house museums, Rough Point has become a model for other historic sites grappling with similar questions about how to interpret difficult histories, how to balance preservation with critique, how to honor the past without sanctifying it, and how to make historic houses relevant to contemporary audiences who are increasingly skeptical of wealth worship and increasingly interested in honest reckonings with historical injustice. The mansion has also become a site for academic research, with scholars accessing the extensive archives that document not just Doris Duke's life but also the operations of the household, the management of the properties, the financial records that show exactly how wealth flows and accumulates, and the correspondence that reveals the human dynamics of power and dependence. And this research continually produces new insights that complicate and enrich our understanding of the Gilded Age, of 20th century American culture, of gender and class, and of how individual choices both shape and are shaped by larger economic and social structures. Perhaps most importantly, Rough Point serves as a tangible reminder that the question of what to do with inherited wealth, with fortunes built on harm, with beautiful things purchased through exploitation, is not a theoretical exercise but an ongoing, practical challenge that every generation must face. We inherit structures, economic, social, political, that we did not create, that often benefit us in ways we didn't choose and may not deserve, and we must decide whether to simply accept and enjoy those benefits, to critique them from a position of comfort, to actively work to dismantle them, or to find some middle path. That involves both benefiting from and working against the systems we inherit, and there are no easy answers, no pure positions, only the messy, complicated work of trying to be less complicit, less harmful, more just, even knowing that we'll never fully succeed. Doris Duke herself seemed to recognize this in her final years. Her decision to create a charitable foundation, to open her homes as museums, to direct her wealth toward public benefit rather than private dynastic preservation, was not a simple act of altruism, it was also an attempt at legacy management, a way to be remembered for more than scandal and eccentricity, a gesture toward redemption that some see as genuine and others see as inadequate given the scale of the original harm, and both perspectives have validity, both are worth holding simultaneously, because this is the nature of moral complexity. Most people are neither heroes nor villains but something in between, most fortunes are neither purely good nor purely evil but some mixture of legitimate value creation and illegitimate exploitation, and most legacies are neither wholly praiseworthy nor wholly condemnable but require us to make difficult judgments about proportion, about context, about what we're willing to forgive and what we're not. Standing on the terrace at Rough Point today, looking out at those same crashing waves, you can feel the full weight of this history, the beauty and the tragedy, the privilege and the loneliness, the treasures and the costs, the human desire for connection and the way that extreme wealth so often destroys the very connections we most need, and you can ask yourself the questions that this house poses to every visitor. What would you do with inherited wealth? How would you balance enjoyment with responsibility? Could you open the gates, literally and figuratively, to share what you've been given? Could you tell the truth about where it came from? Could you acknowledge the harm while still benefiting from the fortune? Could you use wealth as a tool for justice rather than just as a means of personal consumption? And knowing what you know now about the costs, about the human price, about the Eduardo Tirellas of the world who were crushed against the gates, about the servants who polished silver and remained invisible, about the tobacco farmers and the cigarette smokers whose addiction and death purchased every painting and porcelain and Turkish rug, could you live in such beauty without guilt consuming you, without the knowledge of its origins tainting every moment of enjoyment, or would you, like Doris Duke ultimately did, feel compelled to give it away, to transform it into something public, to open the gates and invite the world in, not as an act of pure generosity but as an act of necessary reckoning, an attempt to balance accounts that can never truly be balanced, to pay debts that can never fully be repaid, to transform an inheritance of harm into a legacy of, if not redemption exactly, then at least honest acknowledgement and partial restitution. The story of Rough Point, then, is not just the story of one mansion or one woman but a story about America itself, about the fortunes built on slavery and tobacco and industrial exploitation and financial manipulation, about the way those fortunes persist across generations creating dynasties of privilege, about the performance of taste and culture that old money uses to justify its position, about the invisible labor that maintains the whole system, about the way that extreme inequality isolates everyone, the wealthy from humanity and the poor from opportunity, about the scandals and crimes that wealth can obscure but never quite erase, about the complicated moral terrain of inherited advantage, about the possibility and limits of using tainted wealth for public good, and about whether, in the end, opening the gates to a mansion can ever really constitute justice or if it's simply the least that those who inherit palaces owe to those who were never invited inside. Rough Point survived the scandal, survived the controversies, survived the death of its mistress, and survived the legal battles that followed, not by hiding its history but by revealing it, not by sanitizing its story but by complicating it, and in doing so, it transformed from a private palace on the edge of catastrophe into a public mirror that reflects our deepest anxieties about wealth, power, beauty, justice, and the question of what we owe to each other. And perhaps that transformation, that willingness to look honestly at the full story, to acknowledge the darkness alongside the splendor, to preserve both the treasures and the truths, is the real legacy of Rough Point, more valuable than any collection, more important than any architectural detail, more enduring than any fortune, the legacy of honest reckoning, of refusing to let wealth purchase a sanitized history, of insisting that if we're going to preserve and celebrate these places, we must also preserve and confront their full, complicated, morally tangled stories. Because only by understanding where we've been, only by acknowledging what these palaces cost and who paid the price, can we begin to build something different, something more just, something that doesn't require crushing anyone against the gates to maintain its beauty, and that is the lesson that Rough Point teaches, the gift that Doris Duke, intentionally or not, left to us all, not the mansion itself, magnificent as it is, but the opportunity to look honestly at wealth and its consequences. To ask the hard questions, to refuse easy answers, and to imagine what it might mean to finally, truly, open the gates.